Different than adultery. Fornication is physical impropriety with someone that's not your spouse. Okay? But the more liberal school, which was called Hillel, H-I-L-L-E-L, they decided on a much broader definition. And they actually said that a woman could be divorced if she put too much salt in his food. Ah, Arlene, salt, not good.
No problem.
Okay. If she went in public without her head covered, if she talked with men in the streets, if she spoke disrespectfully of his parents, won't mention names, or if she was a brawling woman, she could be divorced just because. Get this, there's a rabbi, his name is Akiva. He's actually recorded as teaching this. No favor meant that a man could divorce her if he found another woman more attractive. That's pretty scary. You know, I mean, you could be, walking down the path and say, look, you're out because, the neighbor girl that moved in 3 counties away, she caught my attention. Bye-bye. So you can imagine being good, devout Jews, which one they picked. And they picked ways to get around the law the easiest. So the reality is, when Christ is teaching here, the reality is that divorce had grown to be too easy. And a situation had actually developed where the Jewish girls refused to get married because there was no security in being married. And so rather than get married and get divorced and get married and get divorced, they just they refused to get married. For the Greeks, it was a little bit more complicated because there were 2 things that they had to deal with. The first one was relationships outside of marriage were accepted. In fact, they were expected. It was no big deal for a man to have activity outside of his spouse. And it was just part of life. I mean, they expected it. And some of you say, well, it's not like that anymore. Well, yeah, it is. When I worked at Publix, one of the guys that worked with me, I was talking about being married almost 25 years. He goes, well, you have a girlfriend, right? And I said, what are you talking about? He goes, you got a girlfriend, right? And I said, no. He goes, well, in my culture, that's okay. It's very accepted. And this is 2008. And I'm not saying he was the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I'm just telling you, but in his world, which was his mind, it was okay. This is actually a writing from early on in Greek history. We have courtesans for the sake of pleasure, concubines for daily cohabitation. We have wives for the purpose of having children legitimately and having a guardian for our household affairs. Let's go back to that time, huh? It's amazing that's how people thought. It's amazing. We look at it now and we think, oh, how could you think that? See, for the Greeks, there was a difficulty for women, and that was this. A respectable woman, someone that was honorable, lived a life of seclusion, never came out of her house. She could not eat in the husband's apartment. She could not walk the streets alone. She was expected to live a life of extreme moral purity. But not the man. You see, the Greeks only married for security. They went and found their pleasure elsewhere. You guys know who Socrates is, right? Really smart guy? This is what he wrote. Is there anyone to whom you trust more serious matters than your wife? And is there anyone to whom you talk less? Hey, that's 2008, man. Isn't that what we're told? We're told, man, you need to communicate with your wife more, tell her what's going on, right? So Socrates and the whole culture, the whole thing there was really skewed from what Christ and what God wanted. So in Greece, there was a temple. It was a temple created to Aphrodite at Corinth. It came into existence. This is a church. Okay, it's a church. They had 1,000 temple prostitutes. And you went to church to be with the prostitute, and you paid. And they used the money to build new temples. So in a way, it was a missions project, if you know what I'm saying. Okay? My point is that became acceptable. That these men would just go to the temple and then they would come home. They would spend money and they would come home. Okay, we don't call them temples anymore. They're called other things. Okay? My point is that this became not only accepted, it became expected. And so for the Greeks, the whole social system was based on relationships outside of marriage, but only for the men, not for the women. And so you can imagine how these relationships could possibly destroy a man and ultimately destroy homes. Because they're finding the thrill and the fun with someone who's not their spouse. But the second part for the Greeks that made it really hard was they did not have a legal process to be divorced. There was no process at all. All you had to do was have 2 witnesses and give the dowry back intact. You're done. No paper, no nothing. No legal documents. Just walk up and say, I don't like you no more. You're out. and it's over with. So you can imagine how Christ's teaching of faithfulness and chastity is received in a culture where he's walking in telling these guys that are catting around, you got to stop. Okay? The third, for the Romans, the home was a big deal to the Romans. It was actually central to the culture. Everything in the culture revolved around the home. And the woman was not secluded like the Greeks. So if you're out in the countryside and you were to see a woman, you could assume that she's not Greek, but that she was Roman. Okay? Simply because of the culture. The marriage to the Romans was seen as a lifelong commitment. In fact, historically, if you've ever wondered this, the first divorce that was recorded was a gentleman, Spurius Carvilius, or however you say his name, and his wife couldn't bear him children, so he divorced her. Now, historically speaking, in a military way, the Romans conquered the Greeks. We all know that. However, the Greeks conquered the Romans in terms of culture, and in terms of thought, and in terms of education. And by the 2nd century, the Greek morals had infiltrated Rome to the point where it was in total disarray. And had something at this point not happened, chances are, where we're sitting today would be extremely different. Because the United States is a direct descendant, influentially, of the Roman and Greek cultures. There's no doubt about that. And so into this comes Christ, and divorce at this point, like the United States, divorce was as common as marriage. About 50% of them were over soon. And women actually began to identify their lives by the names of their husbands. Like they would say, oh, that happened in Robert 4, and that happened in John 7, by how many years they had been married to their husbands. That's how they kept track of their life history. Marriage had become, unfortunately, it had become a necessity. As I was putting this program together, I went to the story in the Bible of the woman at the well. You guys familiar with the story? Jesus walks up,